This is Linux in Laws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever else fancies your tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy, Mum? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back on a speaker in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35, or any pets, including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusted guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. Welcome to Linux in Laws, Season 2, Episode 8.
Martin, I'm almost tempted to repeat the obvious. How are things?
Things are fine, thank you. What about yourself?
Can't complain, Martin. Can't complain. It's the summer of 2027.
You're clearly not British anyway, otherwise you would be complaining.
Exactly. No, I finally managed to retire. But the thing is...
Again?
What? Yes, again, because, for some reason, time travel doesn't check out. I don't know what's wrong with the device you sent me, but maybe you can take it back to the manufacturer because this device has serious flaws.
Sure, we can work on that, yeah.
Perfect. So how are things over in your end? Given the fact that it's almost your retirement age too, no? Given the fact that you're slightly younger than myself.
Well, it was all downhill from a certain age anyway.
And with that, I would like to welcome Stuart and Todd. But before I get anything wrong, maybe Stuart and Todd can introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my name's Stuart Mackintosh. I'm the president of the Perl and Raku Foundation since 2019, I think it was. I'm here to support the foundation, to help develop it, and help with the board, support the board with organisation and planning.
Hi, I'm Todd Rinaldo, and I am a recent member of the board. I'm also a sometimes conference organizer, sometimes CPAN contributor, where we submit feature modules, and sometimes Perl 5 porter.
But before we go any further, people, maybe 4 people or maybe even 20 people, given the fact that we are speaking to a younger audience, maybe we should clarify what Perl really is, and maybe because you already mentioned CPAN, Todd, maybe you can shed some more light on. I'm almost tempted to say 67 years of program language history, but I think I'm exaggerating here, because when I ran into Perl in early 93, it was already in existence. But then I'm old, so Stuart and Todd, please shed some light on what Perl really is and the history, just to kind of get us started.
Before you do that, Todd, just to check something with yourselves. Is it the Perl Foundation or is it the Perl and Raku Foundation?
Okay. So it has been the Perl Foundation. And of course, Raku, I'll explain what Raku is as well, I think, to the audience, because not everyone knows. Indeed. But just say, what is Perl? It's that Perl is a language, it's computer language, and effectively what computer languages do is they help humans tell computers what to do. So the computer hardware is switches, ones and zeros, silicon, electricity at a very basic level. There's various layers of organization of systems that tell those switches what to do. And where Perl fits in this is it's the part where the person can type into a computer and tell use the instructions, which then get compiled, that tell the hardware what to do. So that's where Perl is. It's I think Todd maybe get into some of the history of that and some of the and explain CPAN and so on. But I think one of the things that's there's many languages. Ultimately, they tell the same computer what to do. There's just different languages. They're more for different types of people. Some people prefer a lot more very structured languages. Some people more free-flowing. Depends on the task you're trying to do. And where Perl fits into that, when I've talked to people and I've asked them, why did you choose Perl? The most frequent response for the people who are really connected to Perl and write a lot is that they feel that it's very easy for them to think what they want to think and then translate that into the computer. It can be very flexible. It's very useful for starting with ideas and then developing it, but it also can be very structured. And in the more recent times, there's a lot more structure that's been brought to Perl to allow bigger systems to be created and to allow software to be created by one person and another person to be able to then continue the maintenance as well. So that's very simply what Perl is. But of course, there's a lot more to it than that. And the other thing I think, I'll touch on Raku as well. So Raku was kind of born from Perl. There was going to be a Perl 6. And Perl 6 was a lot of the thoughts were to try and address some of the challenges to optimize Perl, to enable it to work on newer computers, to work with better multiprocessing, all sorts of the new and emerging trends. And it got to the point where it had taken on so many of these changes that it started to be, there was a tension between the past and the future where Perl 6 was really trying to address some of these new challenges and had to break away from what is Perl 5. And there's a lot of friction around this process, mainly because of the change for the people rather than the software. And you get to the point where people want to be part of the old and the new, but they start having their own life and go on a different journey. So a couple of years ago, it was the communities came to a conclusion. I won't say there was a simple decision. It was a very difficult process with lots of people having lots of views, and it was a difficult challenge. But it got to the point where to enable the two to go on their own journeys, that Perl 6 became Raku. So Raku then has a separate steering committee to technically manage it. And then the thought was, well, Raku needs a foundation because it needs to have the same things managed that Perl has. And that's the foundation does the boring things that the developers aren't necessarily interested in. So the question then is, should Raku have its own foundation? But then there's an overhead to running that. So then the conclusion was that the Perl Foundation will also be the custodian for the Raku Foundation as well. And there was a decision that the board made that for a period of time, a period of 2.5 years, the foundation will be known as the Perl and Raku Foundation. And after this time, if it turns out that that's felt right and it's worked, then maybe that becomes more intrinsic. And if it turns out that it didn't really work, then there is obviously the opportunity of having the Perl and Raku as separate foundations. But that's the future. And we're not trying to solve every problem now. We're on a journey, and that's the current position that Raku is. So there's a little bit about Raku, and I think Todd can help us more on some more detail about what Perl is.
Sure, Todd and Stuart, that has been more than insightful, and especially with regards to the foundation or the rest of it. But maybe before we go into a little bit more detail, we should probably explain what Perl really is, because, okay, flashback. It's 93. Chris is learning a programming language called Python, but Chris is also taking a very active look at Perl. Python didn't really have an ecosystem then, but Perl, I think, at the stage, but maybe I'm completely mistaken, already had this CPAN thing. At this point in time, both scripting languages were, I'm almost tempted to say, looking for a spot in the limelight, but for some reason, Perl had a head start in terms of an awful lot of the internet, actually. If you take a close look at Spam Assassin, just to name one example, is actually riding on Perl. Spam Assassin, of course, being probably the most used, what's what I'm looking for, spam filtering software in an open source ecosystem as part of your postfix, Dorfkat, and all the rest of it, email infrastructure set up. Given the fact that Perl has a lot of going for it in the overall internet, not only in internet infrastructure, maybe, and not too sure who's going to take this, but maybe you can explain rather, a little bit of the history, what's behind Perl, because there's this guy called Larry Wall. I think that he was pretty instrumental with getting things off the ground. And given the fact that Martin and myself are almost granddads, now is probably the time to shed more light on the history of Perl as one of the crucial components of the last 30 years of not only the internet, but rather kind of the open source community in general.
Well, I will leave Todd to get into the detail, but I think the spam assassin case there is really useful. There's so many of those. Everyone, Perl has been called the glue of the internet. It is just everywhere. And I think one example is that if you look at Debian, you see how much Perl sits in Debian. It's increasing all the time. There's a huge quantity of Perl code within Debian. Of course, Debian sits beneath Ubuntu, which the amount of Linux and virtual machines and systems, almost everyone's computer, you type Perl and it's going to run. So it's prevalent. It's everywhere. It's certainly understated. But anyway, I'll hand to Todd to get some of the history and background.
Hi. So, we could go a lot of different directions with this. I think your initial question was talk about the early days of Perl. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Perl was put together by Larry back in the late 80s. And he was working on a project, and he actually kind of put it together as a very simple language. He wanted to, he was back then, awk and sed were kind of your tools that you would use for some of the things he was doing. And he wanted something a little bit more powerful that people could use to automate their tasks. And so he started writing Perl he started with Perl 1, and it kind of expanded from there. I'm trying to find a version history here, but it quickly went from Perl 1 to Perl 2 to Perl 3. When you talk to most people, they either started most likely with Perl 4 or Perl 5. That was kind of the real versions that people started actively using. Perl 4 lacked a lot of features, specifically around object-oriented languages, although some people would tell you that Perl 5 doesn't have object-oriented programming. It's actually the language I got my start on. I was in my early days at university, and I had been programming and trying to learn C, and I was constantly frustrated because back then you had to either have a lot of money or access to somebody with a lot of money to find a C compiler that would work right. And so when I ran into this Perl language, I discovered something that I could get essentially for free that I could install and use. And well, this thing is basically like lazy C was how I thought of it, because at the time I didn't have to declare my variables or size them or anything. I could just go ahead and use them and they would just work. And I loved that. And it was funny. I spent quite a bit of time in my early coding just saying, well, how does it work in C? Well, it probably works that way in Perl too. And I could almost code like it was C. And these days it's funny when I look at code from other people, I can tell whether they are a Perl program, primarily a Perl programmer or a C programmer based on how they do their for loops. So Larry continued developing Perl 4, and then I think it was in the mid 90s, he switched over to coding Perl 5.0. And that was when you talk to people about Perl these days, you're really talking about Perl 5. Perl 5, he implemented a feature called Bless, which was a very simplistic, very basic method that you could use to create object-oriented programming, but without a lot of structure or rules. And so one of the phrases that is used with Perl programming, or when you talk about Perl programming, is Tim Toady, which is there's more than one way to do it. And that has very much been a spirit of Perl. And so there, some languages are very restrictive about how you go about doing a certain task. If I want to do something, I ask, how do you do it? And they say, you do it like this. With Perl, the answer is, well, you could do it this way, you could do it that way, you could do it another way. And so for the expert, that's very attractive, that I'm not bound by rules that say I have to do it this way, and if I step out of those bounds, I have to fight with the programming language to do what I want. So that took us into Perl 5 in the mid 90s, and 5 has been kind of ongoing. Been developed since then. Around Perl 5.8, Larry came out, and so this was in the early 2000s, and said, Perl 5 was my attempt at providing a language that you would want. And he said, now I'd like to step back and say, and work on the next major version of Perl, that would be Perl 6. And I'd like to see what you, the community, want. And he made it, and that's what eventually became Raku. So they started working on Perl 6, but meanwhile, there were a lot of people in major companies that were continuing to use Perl 5. And so there started to be somewhat of a parallel development where after a while of Perl 6 not coming out, people continued to use the Perl 5 that was running their businesses and making them money. And to this day, we've gone from Perl 5.8 to now we're on Perl version 536. Actually, 538 just came out recently. So it continues to improve, and there are more features being added, and more bugs being created or being fixed as we go along. It is available on lots of platforms, some that surprised me today. We were just having a conversation yesterday about how you can still compile a recent version of Perl on VMS, and it functions normally because there's actually somebody who maintains that port.
Sorry, for the younger people among us, VMS was actually the first microkernel, I think, on the planet, developed by the Digital Equipment Corporation back in the 50s or something? I'm joking. I think it came into light in the 80s, but if Mark and other microkernel architectures, maybe even what's the word? I can't even remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They all took a leaf from that book, because VMS actually was the first microkernel in an operating system context on the planet. So VMS goes back to the 80s, and that would be an operating system from the past, just to fill people in there.
And to my knowledge, I'm still confused about the difference between VAX and VMS, but you can actually install that operating system even today on some architectures, I believe in Intel architecture, and get it to work.
I think it's these days it's called an open VMS, if I'm completely mistaken. Links people may or may not be in the show notes. suffice it to say, but the idea was, of course, at the time, without diverting from the subject too much, the idea was actually to decompose a monolithic operating system kernel into much smaller units. And Plan 9 and also something called Windows NT at the time all took a leaf from that book. And yes, people, we're talking about the late 80s, early 90s. So we're looking at almost kind of 30, 40 years of operating system technology at the end of the day. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's interesting to hear about the legacy of that programming language, because Perl, alongside, can I name Python, or would that be too much of a competitive play? I don't know, but
it's not competitive. I think it's the important thing is to say that there isn't this competitive fight. There are different tools for different people for different jobs, and as long as we're looking forward, not competing, but think more how complementary, there's no reason why you can't write this in Python if that suits better, or this person decides Perl or Raku. So I think it's important as well not to feed the people who like the idea of this. Let's fight against which language is the better. That doesn't help anyone. So let's make sure we see these all as all advancing how all of us work and running the same computers using different tools.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was actually going to ask a question on that subject, because unlike Chris, I don't tend to learn programming languages very often. But I did come across Perl
Martin,
back in the day as well. But yeah,
Martin, but then you're old.
what's that got to do with it? You're never too long to learn. You noticed.
But you see, the thing is, basically, I'm older than you are, but I still learn Rust and some other crazy tricks.
You just want to be a hipster and hang around in cafes and stuff.
Absolutely, Martin. Point well taken. You just go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, I came across Rust in a similar time, but just as part. Sorry, not Rust. Perl as similar time as Chris, as part of debugging some software of some sort. But I never really learned it. But you were talking about not competing with other languages. Clearly, a lot of software components have been written in Perl. Going forward, clearly there are very popular languages out there. Are people still taking up Perl? And what would you say? Why should people be learning it or taking it up in terms of skills? Because clearly, there's popular languages out there, and Chris mentioned Rust is a great fan of stuff like that. It's very, let's say, popular. So can you add some words to, let's say, why is Perl very important, or what is good about it? What's it good for? I know a little bit about the scripting side, but I don't know what else it is good for, really.
Oh, Perl. I'm sorry, Todd, you go for it.
So I find that I still think about a quote that I read in an Anne Rice book, and she talked about how as you learn different languages, it causes you to think differently. And I find that's true of spoken languages, but I also find that it's true of coding languages. And very often, if you look at how people will solve that problem in Python or Rust or Perl, they will solve it very differently. And sometimes you will find that something can be very trivially done in Python or in Perl, but it's a little bit more of a challenge in the other languages. When you talk about Rust is very much about being a more secure language. It's a compiled language. So Whereas Perl is a scripted language, which means I can write this code, and in theory, it can pretty much run on any platform without having to rebuild it. Now, there's of course a big star on that, but there's a big star on that for most scripting languages, which is that Windows kind of works because it's not a POSIX compliant operating system. I like Perl because it is easy for me to get what's in my head out. It's easy to prototype things and get a quick proof of concept, but it's also easy for me to write very large amounts of code and maintain that over time. So
okay, so that's interesting point when you said it's easy to, let's say, write something what I have in my head in Perl. Would you say that that's different from other languages then? Or is that one of its strong points?
I would say that's one of its strong points. I find that compiled languages require a little bit more structure to get going. Some languages have a lot more boilerplate to get going. You know, the size of a hello world program in different languages is different lengths. In Perl, it's literally one line of code. So it kind of and that is both Perl's blessing and its curse, if depending on who you talk to, because that boilerplate is not required to write a Perl program. It also means that there's sometimes some ambiguity that you wouldn't have if you had those other languages.
I think that's a really good point, because one of the criticisms I've heard around Perl is that Perl sometimes is, it's been called a write-only language, for example, where it's hard to read, but that's not anything to do with the language. A language allows that, but that's actually down to the disciplines of the people who write it, and the language Perl does not require these things. If you were, I find I would go to Perl after I'd write something in Bash, and at the point that my Bash program is just beyond the capabilities, or it's too unstructured, it's hard to manage, that's the time to consider doing it in Perl. But my day job isn't writing code, and for the things that I do, that's just fine. I wouldn't take on a main project, a customer project that's of consequence, of size, a commercial project in that same way. But again, it's not because of the language. What you would do with any commercial project is you'd work out what the need is, you would work out the specification, and you design the software program before you start to write it. And by taking that approach, Perl lends itself very well to that. It's just that you can also take other approaches. And I think one interesting exploration into looking at why, I had a couple of conversations with companies who were looking to come off Perl, and they said, well, we find it really hard to work with the Perl we've got. When you look at these companies, what you discover is that if it wasn't for Perl, they may not have got there, because it wasn't that the software itself is a problem, that the language is a problem. It was the fact that they didn't have a business plan when they started. So they just started writing code, and it was the ability for the developers, when someone says, hey, I've had an idea, there's this thing, can we make it do this thing? The developers would do the thing, and there it was. It didn't need to be something that someone else had used or had been built before. It could just be created. And it's that kind of agile approach to some of the businesses that have shaped the last 20 years. And there's some pretty significant organizations now who are, everything they do is, or mainly is based on Perl, and some of the large financial companies as well, many of the fintechs. They've built these things because people just wrote the code, they just got on with it. So that's the strength of Perl enabled that to happen, and it just works. It goes. Once it's built, it goes. But of course, if you come back to that later and you're 10 years down the line, you've got a different team. If it wasn't documented, if it wasn't structured, it will be difficult. My response to those people who said, well, we want to come off Perl because of these problems is, well, yeah, okay, retire the Perl and replace it with Perl, but done properly, structured. And that's more about the business, the mature business, and having those disciplines and making sure that everything's documented, that the modules are the right shape, that you write the right modules in the right shape, and that you understand your logic. So there's no reason why you wouldn't continue to do Perl, as you have no doubt a large team of people. But it's the choosing to do that. That's where the challenges are. So, but there's the opportunity, and this is why Perl is prevalent. It's why it's in so many places, because it just allows you to do the thing, and that's it doesn't get in your way.
Interesting point. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a friend who always jokes about this thing that happened to him one time where somebody was complaining about this bit of code that was written in Perl, and he's like, "Oh, that old thing. We totally need to rewrite that. It's been sitting over in the corner there, and nobody's touched it for 20 years." But the other side of that is that means somebody wrote it 20 years ago, and it's still actually continuing to work and function and get the job done for 20 years. So
absolutely. I mean, I found it not long ago. I had someone come to me, ask me to look at a bit of code, and I said to the guys, I've not written code for years, and they said, yeah, I know. It was something I wrote in the 90s, which sits behind an email system, which I didn't even know was still in use. I've not written code for a long time in that for any production activities, and software doesn't wear out, and because of as Todd explained, it runs on many platforms, old and new. That code will keep going. So if the need hasn't changed, if the profile hasn't changed, the security profile, the performance, and so on, the code doesn't need to. It's a huge endorsement of its longevity, and it'll be there in 100 years as well.
Very valid point, because that precisely boils down to something called the technical depth. If you take a look at any bank on this planet, their core banking system probably, if they haven't set up shop in the last 10 years, I suppose, their core banking system, chances are, hasn't changed in the last 20 plus years. For a reason, I might add, because the core banking system is something that their business rides on. So if they change this, they are taking a risk. But at the same time, if it works, why change it in the first place? And I reckon that goes for much of the existing Perl code base. And leaning forward, I'm almost kind of tempted to say that wouldn't be possible without an ecosystem, which brings me nicely to my next question. If you take a look at any modern / recently modern program language, I'm tempted to say the forbidden word like Python, like Rust, even C++ has something now called Canon. Anyway, more often than not, they bring the ecosystem with them. If you take a look at, just naming Rust as one example, if you take a look at crates.io, going forward, or rather mentioning Python, there's this PyPy thing as a curated archive of modules. And needless to say, I reckon, I'm almost tempted to say that Perl was one of the first contenders in this space with CPAN, because a program language, at least in my book, is not about what you basically write from scratch, but rather how you can combine business logic to achieve a certain goal. And that's exactly where this ecosystem comes into play, because if I write a program these days, almost exclusively, I take a look at what's out there already and then simply write the glue code with regards to missing functionality so that I can achieve that goal. But at doing so, I still rest on the shoulders of giants. Given the fact that alongside CTAN, of course, CTAN standing for
comprehensive text.
Yes, thank
and
you.
And CCAN as well. There's many inspired by CPAN.
This goes back to the kind of 90s. Maybe you can shed some more light on where crates.io and similar ecosystems took a leave of that book.
Yeah, so when you talk about having, when way back in the old days, and during the Perl 4 era, the cool kids used Matt's script archive, which had essentially small bits of code that you could use to do whatever you need to do. And so I didn't have to figure out how to do this. I could just go there and grab the code and use it. When Perl 5 came along, modules or bits, which would basically be individual files that would do a thing, came along, and we developed something called PAWS, which is called the Perl Authors Upload Server. And so authors could then upload tarballs or bundles of files that would include a module that solved a certain problem. And then and so that was simply a list of modules. On top of that, somebody came along and wrote a site called CPAN, which then kind of this became the front end to all of those uploads that people have been doing. And one of the benefits to most of those modules, the modules had pod or documentation inline in the code. And so when you would go to CPAN, you would not only would you find the module, but you would find all the documentation for that module. So it made it really easy. And when Andreas first put PAWS online, he had a policy of just literally, whatever you want to upload within reason, that is going to be preserved in the PAWS archive for everybody to have access to. I think there are very few exceptions where we have ever purged something from the PAWS archive, and that was basically because it was malicious code. But I know of maybe 2 incidents, and in both those cases, those weren't even intentionally malicious. It was just kind of a miscommunication about what was intended there. So CPAN's kind of evolved into very much of an ecosystem. From that PAWS, we had CPAN testers that came along on top of that. And what would happen is every time you would upload, CPAN testers, when people would go to install those uploads, they could the modules that came along also came with tests. And when you would run those tests, it would validate that the module behaved the way you expected on your machine. And that module may not behave the way you expected because, I'm on Solaris, and the error code from the operating system is slightly different when the file is missing than it would be if I was on a Linux system. And so because I have those unit tests, the unit test will fail and notify the installer that, hey, this thing may not work the way you think it's supposed to work on this platform. Or it can be if you run it on Perl 5.8, which is considered very old, it may pass, but then later as 5.36 comes along, we may have some restriction that might make it not work. And usually Perl goes out of its way to be backwards compatible. There are very few exceptions where they will actually break old code. That's considered one of the strengths of Perl 5 is how even on the most modern version of Perl, most of the code that people wrote 10, 15 years ago continues to work even on the latest version of Perl. So people would run these tests, and then we provided a way that they could upload their test results. And so then they aggregated those test results, and they would provide that information back to the author. So the author could then know that this module that they had wrote and the test that they had to run with it, well, they can now see on a very clean matrix that, yeah, it works in all of these places, but it doesn't work on Windows if you're on version Perl 5.14 or below. And so now the author has tools to understand how to improve their code. stability of their code on different platforms. Go ahead.
Interesting observation there. Going back to your remark about malicious code, if I take a look at, just to name another Rust example, Crates.io and all the rest of them, they do an awful lot of, they do deploy an awful lot of effort to ensure that no malware enters that space. How does CPAN measure up in terms of code analysis, reduction of the attack surface in general way to ensure, similar to PyPy in the Python context now, to ensure that no malicious code enters that widely used ecosystem of modules?
You may not like this answer, but the answer is it doesn't.
Okay.
And it's important to think of pause, which is kind of the initial place where people upload it to. That essentially anybody can upload it, and in that, quite honestly, is a problem with a lot of archives, not just CPAN. Is that there's no necessarily way to assure that whoever's uploading that thing didn't have malicious intent. In many ways, that becomes a task for distributions that then later ship these as RPMs or Debian packages to help assure that those packages are in good shape and safe to use. So there are two ways you can install these packages. There is a client you can use to install that package, but on a lot of platforms, those packages come out of the box or with a simple yum or apt command to install them, and they're monitored by maintainers. In my opinion, in my experience, CPAN tends to be very safe, and as you tend to be on CPAN for longer and longer, you tend to get to know those other authors. I can't say I've ever run into an author where I've been particularly worried about what they produce, that it might be malicious. The example I'm telling you about, it was actually somebody who uploaded a module, and they simply wanted to know how many people were using their module. So he wrote a call home in his module so he would know whether it was being used. And when the people monitoring the uploads noticed that, they contact him, and it was very much a, hey, you can't do that, and it was taken out. So not really malicious, but it was something that they didn't want happening.
So I think it would be, just to add a bit of context to this, of course, there's all of these libraries and repositories are at risk to supply chain attacks. And frequently we know PyPy has had an NPM. They've had significant problems with large volumes of people putting new modules in with similar names as other ones, and all sorts of typo squatting and so on. So there is a challenge there. I think one of the differences with CPAN, which just to understand the context of what Todd is saying there, is that maybe it sounds like there's less checks and there's less vulnerabilities, is the fact that CPAN is very much of a place where humans are. And these people know the people. It's a huge community of people. The authors know what's going on there. You have to register to be able to upload. And so this large network of people are effectively self-governing. It's not anonymous where anyone can just put a module up there and people are suddenly going to use it. And then the other thing is that generally with the Perl modules, you know which ones you want as well. So the ecosystem itself has done a really good job of being aware and being diligent, and hence there hasn't been a problem. Having said that, there's no question that more needs to be done. And actually not because of a deficiency in Perl per se, but because of the new world of regulation, the fact that we're still in the very early years of this computer revolution. We're only, 70 years into the business computing. And if you measure 70 years against how long we've been since we've had cars or electricity or even from Volta through to Edison. If you look at and then go back Industrial Revolution, the ability to have goods produced out of steel and so on. It's very new. It's huge. The digital world is huge, and it's very new. It's 70 years since the first business computer, thereabouts. And in software programming, we're talking 30 years. That's the established languages that are at this level of language that have been around. And we're entering into a new generation where people assume it's going to work. When I started in technology, and as you guys probably and Todd, you were working with people who kind of knew what it was. You could look at the code, you could understand what you're working with. Though we were working at quite a low level, but nowadays people assume they don't need to know all those layers. They're working at a higher level, so there needs to be some trust in the lower levels. And none of the languages really have cracked this. So it's something we're working on over the next year or so. Is how is it we can bring governance and assurance critically without breaking what's there, which is really important to not change CPAN so that people can't use it as they have been, but how can additional information be added to know more about, to be able to compute and understand and get a better perspective of what the software is that you're going to use. And so that's something that we're thinking about. It's, as all these things, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. And it's going to take a lot of people, but it does need to be addressed. And we'd like to see how we can add these additional layers of information so that for the current and future generations, they can make computational informed decisions as to the state of the code that sits beneath. So that's down the line to follow. Watch this space.
One of as an example, I have a OS X install on my desktop on my MacBook, and when I want to install some software, there are a couple of places that I can get it. So the first place I can get it is from the Apple Store, and in that case, it is supposedly reviewed by somebody at Apple, tested and make sure that it meets certain specifications. In theory, they were looking for maliciousness. If something goes wrong, they can literally remove it from the Apple Store, and I've been told that they even have a big red button that they can press to actually remove it from people's systems if it's truly dangerous. But there's another mode that you can have when you can install things where you can install something that is signed by an author, so you know it actually came from that author, but you first need to trust that that author actually was giving you something safe. And the third option is, well, just install everything. Most of the archives that are equivalent to CPAN these days, yes, they have some review, but they're much more in that latter category of you're downloading something, maybe you know it's from an author, hopefully you know who the author is, but very often you don't necessarily know who the author is of whatever that software that was written.
That's very true. I mean, there's clearly a general, let's say, fact of open source software and modules that they rely on.
And proprietary, because of course a lot of proprietary is built on open source as well. It's just you can't see it. So I think it's not a characteristic of open source. It is of digital as a whole.
Indeed. Yeah,
Absolutely.
not something that is going to be solved overnight for sure. That problem, as you say. I was going to ask a final question on the kind of, clearly it's been around for a long time. And as I said to myself, I've never really had the need to learn it. But going forward, where do you see the future of the language, and what are you doing about, let's say, the foundation itself? What is its role there to, continue the state of Perl, or to grow it, to make and get more awareness? Because clearly, as mentioned, there's all these other more modern languages that people dive into because they are more popular for whatever reason.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with what is the foundation, and I think it's important to. There's differences between the Perl ecosystem and the Perl Foundation, the Perl ecosystem, and others. So the first thing is that Perl isn't predominantly funded by any one organization. Many languages have either one or a group of corporate sponsors who get to choose what happens. And of course, all these things are opportunities and threats. However you look at it, they're just different models. So if the corporate sponsor decides to go take it a certain way because they run their systems on it, and that's, it's open source, but they run theirs on it, then that creates a community that follows that corporate, and that might be brilliant for some things and not for others, where Perl is actually led by the community. So the foundation doesn't choose what happens to the software, unlike many of the other ones. The foundation is there alongside the software, the language, and the other communities as its own community. So you could say that the foundation is a community. What it provides is organizational support. Effectively, it does the things, as I said earlier, that the developers don't want to do. If you're motivated to write a code to solve a maths problem because you know Perl and this math problem needs to be explored in Perl, then you'll wake up that day and you'll do that as long as it takes day and night, because that's what you're there to do. But it's very rare that anyone wakes up and feels like that in the same way when it comes to marketing or writing a prospectus or something like that. That's not how the technologists work. So the foundation's there to be the bank manager. That's where it started. People wanted to bring to donate, give some financial support, which is really important. And so you need a foundation to be able to manage the fiscal host. It needs to manage the finances firstly, but also provides things like, you could say, it's the customer services, the stakeholder management. It's there to manage the things that sit on the outside of the technology. It also is there it operates a grants process. So if somebody would like, there's two sides. If someone wants to have a thing made, they could propose this thing needs to be made and put some money against it, or people can write their own proposals to say, I'd like to make this, will you fund it? So there's the grants function is there as well to not only support ideas. I think last year there was an example, TensorFlow was a grant to bring Perl support, and there's also maintenance grants as well. So just to make sure that the language is evolving and the key issues are addressed. There's the legal side. So we've had a couple of times that the legal team have had to get together. We've got the trademark management and IPR. So there's various things that the foundation provides as a side to the language, rather than the body that decides what happens, and that's really important. So the technologists choose what happens to the language, which again is not necessarily like many of the others. Also, the foundation is here, like we're here now talking. We're all volunteers. I say we're all volunteers. There are administration activities which are paid for. But the board volunteer for their roles, and as with the software steering committee as well, volunteer. So it's people who are choosing because of that's what they feel needs to happen amongst peers. The foundation is going to continue. It's come on a long way, and it's going to continue to develop. The second year we've had a prospectus published. The prospectus is I think this last one is excellent. The first one was very good. The second one is much better. There's some good information there, and it helps people understand a snapshot once a year of what we've been doing. So I think that if someone is interested in what's happened and what's going to happen, go and download the prospectus. It's the place to find that information. We do need to think about, in 100 years' time, where Perl will be there in 100 years' time. And what is it going to need? What decisions do we make today that, from a foundation, from a supporting the language perspective, need to be made in order to make sure that in the future people have the best opportunity with the language? So that's where trademarks matter. developing the sponsorship, the marketing advocacy. Most critically is community engagement. I think that's the most important thing. There's also infrastructure as well, supporting out some of the infrastructure and administration. So there's all sorts of things. We're always looking to take more people on. There's information on the website about how to apply to join the board. And I think what I'd like to see on the board is certainly more new ideas. The board is a really good team. Everyone I've engaged with in the Perl ecosystems and Raku have been absolutely amazing people. I think it's an excellent set of people to be with. But I do feel that we need to encourage people from the next generation to get involved as well, and I certainly would encourage that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of future. And we're a listening organisation. We want to hear people. We want to engage with people and stay relevant.
Now, people, that's your final call to action. You just heard the words. If you're looking for a cause, just join the Perl Foundation, I'm tempted to say, because this is I'm almost tempted to say destiny. If you want to be part of history, just join it, because they're looking for people. They're looking for bandwidth. So if you want to continue what has been in existence in terms of running not just the internet, but just way more things than that, just join the Perl Foundation and give it some of your bandwidth. And with that, I'm almost tempted to say now's the time for something called the Poxies, as in the picks of the week. Martin, what's your pox?
Okay. Yeah, sure. My pox of the week is not a, let's say, piece of entertainment for a change, although I do occasionally watch some television. But it is a, let's say in short, I've been painting my house, and the painter I found is very great to work with. So if they want to sponsor us, feel free. But whether or not they'll be listening, I'm not sure. So in that case, let's not keep our hopes up for that one. What about yourself, Chris?
You can't mention your brand names, okay? Why
well, I don't think they're going to be listening anyway. So it's probably wasted effort. Actually,
but they just might. So if you mention that brand name, they might get back to something.
Fair enough.
Linux.eu.
Yeah. No, okay. Well, fair enough. The paint's called Sandalin, so it's
Sandalin.
It's great. Sandalin, yes.
Sutherland. Okay, that's local.
No idea. It's,
okay. So where did you buy it?
In a paint shop.
Your kids haven't told you that you don't buy paint on the internet? No? Okay, fair enough.
Internet? No. It's yeah. Internet's great for certain things, but not for.
I see. Okay. So
cat videos mainly.
Yeah. Before I reveal my pox, Stuart and Todd, what are your poxes?
Well, I offer a book which I stumbled across in the last few days, and it's called Steal Like an Artist. And I'm not condoning stealing for 1 minute, but it's I was very pleased to read it. It's such an analogy on open source, not just open source, but closed source. It talks about how, from an artist perspective, it challenges the fact that artists often don't create original work. What they do is they absorb the various things that other people have done over the years and then make their own take on it. And people who create things commercially still stole all those ideas from the people who gave them away, as much as the people who make things and give them away. It's really advocating making things that are worth stealing. Make your art so that it's so good that other people really want it that much. It's fascinating, and again, it's such an analogy to the work in the open source world. So I'd recommend It's 10 years old. I didn't realize it was 10 years old, but it is 10 years old, and it's as relevant today, and it will be in years to come. So it's quite light as well. It's not a heavy reading book. I'd recommend it.
Well, you say it may be relevant in 10 years' time. I don't know. There's a lot of protests at the moment from the, let's say, the artists and the actors about all the AI taking over their jobs and stuff.
Well, I think that's a misunderstanding about what AI is, but that's a whole nother conversation for another
day.
Which unfortunately we don't have time for. So, Martin, do you know this book?
No, I don't know it. No, but it's it makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense.
Fair enough.
It's the same as you say. It's the same with code, right? If it's well written and very useful, then often copied.
But make it to be stolen. That's the
thing. Yeah.
Okay, Todd, over to your POCs.
So I ran into this a couple days ago, and it made me very sad. They apparently the ships in the Atlantic Ocean were running on a fuel that emitted a lot of sulfur. I assume it was probably some form of diesel, and that they had enforced some policies that had caused the ships to change the fuel they were using and had reduced the pollution from the ships by 80%. The problem is that it turned out that the effect of that pollution wasn't just polluting the air, but it was actually throwing clouds up into the air that were reflecting sunlight and effectively keeping the Atlantic Ocean apparently 1 degree Celsius cooler. And so now that we've reduced this pollution, we're seeing this increase in temperature and finding out that we're actually in a worse case than we started from. And I learned about this and I wanted to cry just a little bit.
Okay.
That sounds typically known as anti-pox, but yes, that sounds.
Oh, this is anti-pox? What is pox?
Yeah, sorry. No, this is anti-pox.
Fair enough, Todd.
It's fine. Yeah.
Which is all great. I mean, don't get me wrong. Poxes are something that you see worth mentioning. It doesn't have to be positive all the time. Now, speaking of which, Todd, if there's anything on the other side, worth mentioning on the positive side, now's the time. But if there isn't, fair enough.
Can I say, write good code that's efficient, that doesn't burn CPU cycles, and you're all doing your bit to help the climate.
There you go.
That's more Raku like Perl, right? I'm tempted to say.
You can write bad code in any language. You can write good code in any language. Yeah. You could poll instead of interrupt. So, just write good code, make it efficient. Think about when you send an email through one of these online systems, how many clock cycles it uses, and think about how there's a lot of opportunity from a digital point of view. 2% of our energy is on computing. What can everyone do to reduce those clock cycles as a developer, as a user? So there's a lot of opportunity.
Maybe get rid of digital currencies as well.
We won't go there anyway.
Another for another day.
Indeed, very much so. Yes, Todd, Stuart, that has been more than enlightening. Let's put it this way. Thank you much for your time, and keep up the good work, and do continue, please, Raku or not, making the internet continue to tick. Because at the end of the day, this is just what Perl is all about. Never mind Raku going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys.
This is the Linux in-laws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, type Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for their song Solid Market, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under CC at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts.